No one symbol embodies the soul of the South more than the Confederate battle flag.
Early war Southern battle flags consisted of a field of 3 equal horizontal bars, red, white, red, and a blue canton decorated with white stars, representing the states of the Confederacy. This pattern was similar to the national flag of the United States, and for that reason, on smoky battlefields, it was easily confused with the Stars and Stripes. Consequently, this specific flag pattern was discarded by units in the field and replaced by a battle flag of a new design. The newly designed flag, square in shape with a red field, traversed by a blue St. Andrew's cross edged in white, contained 13 stars. The new pattern was first issued to Confederate units in Virginia in late 1861, where it became known as the Army of Northern Virginia battle flag. High-quality silk purchased on the open market was used to construct the first issued battle flags. Some flags were sewn by ladies' sewing circles, while others were local products made by friends and loved ones for units going to the front.
With difficult economic times, silk soon became scarce in government depots. Wool bunting was substituted in 1862 and became the primary material for Confederate battle flags through the end of the war.
By the spring of 1862, nearly every unit in the Army of Northern Virginia had been issued this standardized battle flag. Often, but not always, a unit's designation would be painted or sewn to a flag, and later battle honors began to appear on them as well.
This silk flag, carried by the 48th North Carolina of General Robert Ransom's brigade, is an example of the early issue Army of Northern Virginia battle flag.
The original Confederate flag had only 7 stars, which represented the first 7 states to secede. These states in order were South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. This Confederate battle flag has 13 stars, which represent the original 7 seceding states and the 4 additional states that seceded after the firing on Fort Sumter in April 1861. These states were Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Stars 12 and 13, Kentucky and Missouri, never formally seceded from the Union, but were recognized by the Confederate government as part of the Confederacy. The red fabric in this Confederate battle flag was made of 2 different types of material. Running vertically, the threads were made of silk. Running horizontally, the threads were made of cotton. The fly edge, the edge that's farthest from the pole, shows an extreme amount of deterioration due to weather and age. The blue bars on the flag are made of silk and are in the shape of a St. Andrew's cross. When you look closely at the blue bars, you'll see the painted stars. Earlier versions of the Confederate battle flag had painted stars. Later versions of the flag had sewn stars. Here is a closer, detailed look at the fabric of the flag. Imagine this flag actually being flown in the middle of a Civil War battle. It's amazing to have it remain in such good condition. Along the fly edge, the red silk has completely deteriorated, leaving only the brown cotton thread remaining. Here's a closer look at the hoist edge, the edge closest to the pole. Here's a detailed look at the flag's center seam, and also the center of the cross where the 2 bands cross each other. There's also a remnant of a single star, painted dead center. When the stars on this flag were new, they were painted with a gold metallic paint. But over the years, it has flaked off and lost its luster. This flag is a living witness to the Civil War and actually flew in the smoke of battle. It evoked strong emotions from both the Union and Confederate soldiers who saw it on the battlefield. On June 25, 1862, the 48th North Carolina found itself in combat for the first time at the Battle of Oak Grove, Virginia. Commanding the left wing of the regiment was 32-year-old Major Benjamin R. Husk, an attorney from Fayetteville. Husk had previously seen service in the 1st Regiment North Carolina Volunteers and had been in combat with them at Big Bethel. Fighting desperately against elements of the Federal 3rd Corps at Oak Grove, Major Husk was struck in the right foot, the ball driving part of his spur through the foot. Although painfully wounded, Major Husk remained on the field with his men until they were forced to fall back by the overwhelming Federal offensive. The Major's wound was not at first considered dangerous. His men expected that their popular officer would soon recover and return to the regiment, but that was not to be. A dangerous infection had set in. Benjamin Husk's life ended on July 15, 1862.
As a sign of admiration and respect, his comrades sent this silk flag home to his widow, Anna Norwood Husk. This was perhaps the greatest tribute that his grieving comrades could pay. The 48th North Carolina's flag remained in the Benjamin Husk family for over 100 years, as a tribute to the sacrifice he made so many years ago. All canteens issued to Union soldiers were made of tin. In contrast, some canteens issued to Confederate soldiers were made of wood. There were some distinct advantages of wooden canteens. One advantage was because they were made of fruit wood, the water tended to be sweeter to the taste in a wooden canteen.
In this example, we are lucky to have a rare Confederate canteen that was captured by a Union soldier. Confederate canteens made attractive war trophies to many Federal soldiers.
Disadvantages were they were very hard to manufacture, and they had to be kept full of water all the time, or the bands would shrink and the canteen would leak.
Sometimes canteens were exchanged between Union soldiers and captured Confederates, or sometimes they were picked up from the dead, who had no further use for them. Union soldiers often added their names alongside the former owners, or on the reverse side. This cedarwood canteen has a note attached identifying the victor from the vanquished.
Let's take a closer look at this Confederate canteen. On the front of it is a note, attached by Captain James Benson, saying this canteen was worn by him. Captain Benson was captain of Company A, 79th Pennsylvania. If the canteen was worn by him, that means he captured it and wore it through the rest of his service in the war. The note is obviously a very old note and was left by Benson to identify it as his canteen worn in the Civil War. The canvas strap really shows how greasy and grimy everyday life was in the Civil War. Here's a look at the side of the canteen. Were it full of water, the wooden staves on the side would be swollen and tight. The spout of this canteen is made of tin and attached with nails. A tiny wooden cork would hold the water inside. When a canteen is full of water, it's very heavy. It's worn across the body with this canvas sling. The wear on the sling attests to its hard usage during the war. Years after the war, the symbolic image of a canteen was one of soothing and reconciliation. A familiar motto used at many veterans' reunions was, "We drank from the same canteen." This canteen knew no favor for North or South. Its only mission was to quench thirst.
Most firearms used during the Civil War were muzzle loaders. These weapons were very hard to load, especially in the excitement of combat. A soldier was lucky if he could load and fire 3 shots a minute. Even at that rate, it was nearly impossible to use a rifle or musket at close quarters. When unloaded, the weapon could only be used as a club, or, with bayonet fixed, as a long spear. Otherwise, in hand-to-hand situations, the musket was worthless. Soldiers anticipated this fact, and especially early in the war, they sought alternative weapons to carry should they be engaged in hand-to-hand fighting. Some purchased sidearms to increase their advantage in combat. There was by no means a shortage of revolvers, boot pistols, and derringers offered for sale just about anywhere. Many soldiers carried these weapons into battle for added firepower. Another alternative weapon which saw extensive use in the war was the side knife.
Privately purchased side knives were worn on the belt or the person, ready for use in a hand-to-hand struggle.
Knives were familiar articles to the American scene. They were highly coveted personal items in use from the Revolutionary War era all the way through the early 20th century. In early pioneer America, they were used as trade items with Native Americans, who prized a good steel knife as a tool or a weapon. A side knife was an everyday utility item as well as a means of personal protection. Soldiers in both armies of the Civil War were known to have them. Nearly all side knives used during the war were purchased by the individual soldier as opposed to being an Army issue item.
There were examples where large fighting knives were presented to a regiment or a company before leaving for battle.
Several types of fighting knives were extensively used during the Civil War. The Arkansas toothpick, the dagger, the D-guard, and the bowie are some of the named styles. One type, the bowie, already had a romantic link to our early history. It was first seen in the early 1830s in the Southwest as a trusted companion to gamblers and criminals. The name Bowie knife is linked to Jim Bowie, a defender of the Alamo who is known to have used one. Its most distinguished characteristics are the clipped point and its unusually large size of up to 20 inches. The uniquely American style caught on and was produced in Europe for the hungry American market, the best quality coming from England and Germany. American blacksmiths also manufactured many fine Bowie knives. The most common use of side knives was in the Confederate Army. Many Southern soldiers were armed with enormous blades in the early days of the war.
This particular knife was made out of a sword. It was actually a sword that was shortened, cut down and shortened into the form of a knife. It has a clipped point like a Bowie knife because that was a popular style in which knives were made. The blade itself still retains the etching on it that was original to it in the 1830s or 40s when the sword would have been in use. There's an eagle etched with the E pluribus unum on top of a shield. Various other military engravings and etchings appear on the blade. You can see where this point has been cut away from the blade and formed into a Bowie knife clipped point. The eagle head is made of brass with flowing stylized feathers. The eagle has his sharp beak and the fierce look in his eye. The scabbard is also part of the original sword. It had a brass throat, leather body, but it too had been cut down. This section is where the scabbard meets the guard and still retains a lot of its original flavor, original from the 1830s, that is. A close look at the ivory grips. You can see they're hand checkered, coming up to the rake of the eagle's neck and fitted nicely into that piece. This former sword makes a very long knife and is an attractive piece to be used in a close fight. This is a typical Confederate dagger. It's a spear point dagger. It has a leather scabbard, wooden handle, and a steel blade. The blade is roughly straight. The scabbard has a tin tip and a tin throat. These are typical elements of Confederate-made pieces. Confederate-made, that is, for the war. Distinguishes them from regular everyday knives that would have been used by hunters or common people. Again, another dagger, a spear point dagger that has a swell in the end of the blade. Very striking and handsome looking piece. Walnut handle with a copper guard. A very nicely artistically made blade. The spear point is very, very nice and sharp, as you can see at the point. This would have been a very preferable knife to have in a fight. It makes a nasty wound. The spear point is kind of wide if you look at it in a cross section, but when lunged or struck at an opponent, it makes a very nasty wound. This is another example of a fighting knife or dagger. This one was engineered for killing. This particular knife is about 8 inches long. It has a bayonet-like tip of good steel, 4-sided instead of the normal 2-sided. Lightly scratched into the walnut handle of this fighting knife are the words "taken at the Battle of Bull Run," then the date 1862. This attests to its use on the battlefield. The handle of this knife is formed so that it fits nicely into the hand, comfortably. The blade itself, because it's shaped like a bayonet with 4 sides, would make a wound that was very hard to heal. It would open a hole that just wouldn't close. So this knife, particularly, was made as a killing machine. This stag-handled fighting knife, or Arkansas toothpick, is 16 inches in overall length. It's made of very hard steel, probably by a blacksmith. Again, a stag handle, a brass guard, leather scabbard. This knife, too, was engineered strictly for fighting and no other purpose. You can see at close quarters what great reach this knife would have for slashing, hacking, or even just simply stabbing. This is the classic Confederate D-guard knife. It's 19 inches long. It's almost a short sword. As you can see, it too has a spear point blade, a straight blade that's tapered on both sides. It's sharp on each edge. It has a D-guard which protects the hands of the person carrying it, wooden handle, steel mounts, and curiously, on this particular specimen is carved the date 1776. The 1776 is significant, not because it's the date this blade was made, because it wasn't, but because it's the date of America's first war for independence. The Confederates often used this date to relate to, because they too believed they were fighting for their war of independence in 1861.
As attractive as it seemed to carry one of these large knives, it was also difficult. Because of their length and weight, and few if any opportunities for combat use, long knives were frequently tossed away to lighten a soldier's load. Although some blades found targets in combat, most had been abandoned long before. The very idea that the enemy carried such a formidable weapon was food for conversation long after the war ended. Confederate knives especially represented an authentic view of what a Union soldier expected to encounter in combat. As foreboding as they seemed, fighting knives actually did very little fighting. Camp near Martinsburg, September 30th, 1862. Dear Mother, this leaves me in my usual good health and enjoying a few days' rest in camp, which General Jackson now allows us. I received several letters from you last night, dated mostly in August. You were very anxious to receive letters from me, which it was out of my power to write or send. You must remember that our division has been in the advance all the time and had no way of sending back letters like those in the rear. But we had the advantage in the way of provisions. Uncle Kaya still has my shoes. He left my other clothing in Richmond. I am not needing any of them, having captured plenty at Harper's Ferry. I have recovered from all my wounds and have great reason to be thankful that I have been spared my life through so many dangers. Gregg's brigade was the last to cross the Potomac, and being pressed in the rear by a regiment of Yankee cavalry, I was sent back with two of our companies to hold them in check until the brigade crossed. I marched my command about a quarter of a mile from the ford and attacked the advance of the cavalry, driving them back and holding them in check until the whole brigade crossed. I then ordered a retreat, which was done in order and was the last to cross the Potomac. Generals Lee, Hill, and Gregg saw our engagement, they with their respective staffs, remaining between us and the river. General Gregg complimented me highly for performing this duty so well, and the general informs me that General Hill had spoken of it. The enemy fired on us briskly for a while, but never struck a man. They brought up artillery, but we left before it could injure us. The severe shelling of the war was at Batello's Ford on the 20th. At one time it appeared like our regiment would be destroyed, but it was ordered to change position, which saved us. We drove all the Yankees across the river except those killed and taken prisoners. 2 of my men were killed. I was wounded slightly in the shoulder, from which I have recovered, as stated above. 2 of my brave men were killed at Manassas. 12 of my men have been killed in battle. At Manassas, a ball grazed my neck. Another struck one of my knuckles, which turned it from my body, and a piece of shell severely bruised my left hand. I remained in hospital 4 days and then mounted a horse and overtook the regiment at Leesburg and commanded my company from that time until a few days since, when I had to take charge of the regiment, all the field officers being absent. I do not like to invade Maryland. It is too strong for the Union, and I don't wish to see her in the Confederacy. We have lost thousands of our best men. All who made that terrible march were the bravest men of the land, and as good soldiers as ever went into battle. Our soldiers marched barefoot, with blisters from their heels to their toes, and frequently with nothing to eat but green corn. And yet they would march from 3 o'clock in the morning until 10 o'clock at night without complaining. We took Harper's Ferry without the loss of scarcely a man. Our brigade made a forced march from there to Sharpsburg and got there in time to engage in that terrible field of blood and carnage. We occupied the extreme right of the field and being protected by a stone fence, sustained but little loss. I will never attempt to give you a particular description of the eventful march of 7 weeks through which we have just passed, unless I am permitted to again meet you face to face. Manassas and Sharpsburg tell a terrible tale of loss of life, but our men remained as fixed on the bloody field as the stone fences which interspersed it. Our army was never in better spirits than at present and would be harder to defeat than ever. I understand that Longstreet's corps is encamped near Winchester. General A.P. Hill is anxious to take his division to South Carolina for the winter campaign, and it is thought that his wish will be gratified. He has been so successful and fought so many battles that he is in a fair way to become next to Jackson in reputation. We have fought in every battle since the fights at Richmond except Cedar Run. Hill's division all fought there except our brigade. Our brigade is only the skeleton of that fine body of men that left the state last April. I succeeded in capturing a good supply of coffee, salt, and so forth, both at Manassas and Harper's Ferry, which was a great help in our hard and pinching marches. Yesterday was the first mail we had received since the Battle of Cedar Run on the 9th of August, and brought the only letters I have received from home except one by Uncle Kaya. You must remember that our army is not situated like Moore's regiment. We are always in advance. Moore's regiment is near Winchester now, where they can send off their mail. It is uncertain now when I can get this off, but as we are making arrangements to have an election for legislature, I think I can get a chance to send it when the votes are sent off. My love to all. Yours truly, Joseph N. Brown. During the Civil War, both armies required that an after-action battle report be written by every unit commander.
This procedure allowed for a complete and hopefully accurate accounting of each unit's participation in an encounter with enemy forces.
Once written, these battle reports were submitted to Army headquarters where they could be analyzed by the commanding general. This allowed the general an opportunity to gain further insight into the conduct of his subordinates and units in any given encounter. Confederate General Alfred Scales, a brigade commander in the Army of Northern Virginia, wrote his report of the Battle of Gettysburg in camp near Orange Courthouse, Virginia, on August 14, 1863. On July 1st, his North Carolina brigade had undergone a terrible bloodletting west of town when pitted against the Union First Corps and massed artillery arrayed on Seminary Ridge.
In his account, General Scales describes his brigade's fight, which commenced at approximately 3 p.m. and ended 90 minutes later.
Major, I have the honor to submit the following report of the operations of this brigade on Wednesday, July 1st, at the Battle of Gettysburg. After marching about a quarter of a mile without any casualty, we were halted and put in the rear of the artillery belonging to A.P. Hill's corps. Here, General Lane's brigade was changed to the extreme right of the division, leaving my brigade to the extreme left without any change of position. After the lapse of some 30 minutes, we were again ordered to advance, which I did in good order, and under pretty severe artillery fire from the enemy in my front. While thus advancing, I observed a regiment or two of the enemy about a half a mile in our front, marching in line of battle parallel to the turnpike and directly toward the road. They very soon engaged a regiment of our men, supposed to be part of General Davis's brigade, who were advancing on the opposite side of the road. A heavy fight ensued, in which our friends, overpowered by numbers, gave way. Seeing this, the brigade quickened their step and pressed on with a shot to their assistance. The enemy, with their flank thus exposed to our charge, immediately gave way and fled in great confusion to the rear. We pressed on until coming up with the line in our front, which was at a halt and lying down. I received orders to halt and wait for this line to advance. This they soon did, and pressed on forward in quick time, that I might keep in supporting distance. And after marching 1/4 of a mile, a gang came up to the front of the line, halted and lying down. The officers on this part of the line informed me that they were without ammunition and would not advance further. I immediately ordered my brigade to advance. We passed over them up the ascent, crossed the ridge, and commenced the descent just opposite the theological seminary. Here, the brigade encountered a most terrific fire of grape and shell on our flank, and grape and musketry in our front. Every discharge made sad havoc in our line, but still we pressed on at a double quick until we reached the bottom, a distance of about 75 yards from the ridge we had just crossed, and about the same distance from the college in our front. Here, I received a painful wound from a piece of shell and was disabled. Our line had been broken up, and now only a squad here and there marked the place where the regiments had rested. Every field officer of the brigade, save one, had been disabled. In less than 10 minutes after I was disabled and left the field, the enemy, as I learned, gave way, and the brigade, with the balance of the division, pursued them to the town of Gettysburg. I have the honor to be, very respectfully, your obedient servant, Alfred M. Scales, Brigadier General.
Scales' brigade had been fearfully decimated in its gallant attack, losing more than 500 men to the Yankee guns. As for General Scales himself, he would be out of action with a severe leg wound. He would recover and in a few months regain command of his old brigade.
His battle report allows us a unique look at him and his brave North Carolinians at the Battle of Gettysburg. Confederate military belt buckles reflected a vast array of state individuality. Much of this is due to the fact that unlike the North, which issued military supplies through the centralized federal government, each southern state provided much of the uniform and equipment to its troops in the field.
Because of this, troops from Virginia were often uniformed slightly different than troops from Mississippi or North Carolina.
One of the distinctive differences appeared in the military belt buckles that soldiers wore. Aside from the many state designs, there were government waist belt plates issued that displayed the CS or CSA lettering, which identified the wearer as a Confederate soldier. Many varieties were issued, as opposed to the U.S. government, which produced only two types of U.S. enlisted belt plates for its troops. One being an oval U.S., the other a rectangular eagle.
Here are three examples of the Virginia state plate. The top Virginia plate is still on its original belt. This belt plate was produced in the South during the war. In this die-struck example, the female figure can clearly be seen standing over the conquered foe with the motto Sic Semper Tyrannis, which means, thus always to tyrants. This two-piece interlocking example was very popular among Confederate officers. The Georgia state plate is seen here in two variations. Here is the popular style interlocking two-piece officer's plate, this time with the crest of Kentucky in the center. North Carolina produced many variations in state plates. The interlocking belt plate had two pieces. One piece was called the spoon, the other piece was called the wreath. The spoon was inserted into the wreath and then turned to lock, which completed the mechanism and held the belt together. This is an excavated example of a very rare buckle. It's a state plate produced by the state of Alabama. Here is a cartridge box sling plate produced for the state of South Carolina for her troops, showing the state seal. Here is an interlocking South Carolina officer's belt plate, clearly showing the palmetto tree, a symbol of South Carolina. This is a very interesting Confederate States variant belt plate. It was originally a U.S. belt plate, and a Confederate soldier changed the configuration of the U to be a C, thus making it Confederate States.
Northern and Southern militia companies often had specially contracted belt plates in the pre-war days.
Here are two examples of early war Ohio volunteer militia belt plates used by enlisted men in some of the first regiments raised by the state of Ohio. The top example was excavated on the battlefield of Antietam near Dunkard Church. New York officers had the option of buying a sword belt plate with the Old English letters NY on the face of it.
When the war began, the South could no longer get buckles and buttons from northern sources. They were forced to have dies made overseas, mostly in England. The dies were sent across the ocean to southern manufacturers who then produced the product. Some dies were made in the South, but were primitive and produced inferior products. These wartime southern manufactured plates are known as locals. These belt plates were sometimes elaborate in design and always reflected the pride each individual had in his home state. Another type of Confederate military buckle has no insignia at all. These buckles are minimal in appearance, easy to manufacture, and very serviceable. Most of these buckles are sand cast, which requires little technical skill. Many of these buckles saw military service and were seen in all parts of the Confederate Army.
Looking at Confederate belt plates is like looking into a microcosm of the war itself. The South had difficulty manufacturing and distributing these belt plates to our troops in the field. The diversity of plates and equipment shows just how difficult that whole process was. In April of 1865, General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was an army on the run. Forced out of Petersburg, Virginia on April 2nd, Lee's battered but still dangerous army marched westward in a desperate attempt to link up with Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston's army in North Carolina. All along the retreat route, the Federal Army under General U.S. Grant nipped at the heels of Lee's column, clashing with it on numerous occasions during the first week of April 1865. On the 6th of April at Sailor's Creek, Virginia, part of Lee's army was brought to bay and suffered a horrendous defeat. One of the soldiers who fought at Sailor's Creek was Captain John Burns of the 140th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry of the Federal Second Corps. In a letter written home to his father nearly 3 weeks after the battle, Captain Burns describes his participation in the fighting and other leisurely activities.
On the morning of the 6th, we moved out from Burkesville and had not gone more than 2 miles when we discovered that we were marching nearly parallel to a rebel column and wagon train not more than a half-mile distant. 2 batteries were double-quick to the front and began shelling the train. I tell you now, they closed up quickly. Our brigade, being in front, was thrown right forward upon their rear, which was just passing. To get to them, we had to go down a gradual descent, cross quite a large creek, through which we plunged, and then up a long hill. On the way, we passed a large, fine residence surrounded with poultry of all kinds. Though we were going on double quick and under a sharp fire, not a duck, chicken, or turkey was allowed to cross our line. Every boy seemed determined to have a fowl for dinner, if he should live to eat that meal. I knocked a chicken with my sword, grabbed it, and went on. Lieutenant Spragg was equally successful, and when we reached the crest of the hill, there were not less than 30 chickens, 6 or 8 ducks, and 2 turkeys captured by the 140th. I note this as one of the very peculiar characteristics of the American soldier. We fought all day in sight of the train, and just at night struck them such a blow at Sailor's Creek that they left the train and all its contents with several pieces of artillery. The 140th was the first, or among the first, to the train, and officers' trunks and things in general were gone through in short meter. I could have gathered up a fortune in a few moments. I got into a general's trunk and secured his toilet case and a few trophies. I did not look at the name. Some said it was Hunter's, but other things gotten from the trunk had the name of General Harris. I harnessed up 2 mules with saddles and saddle pockets, got a contraband, gave him his orders, and went on after the enemy. We drove them from the hill beyond and encamped for the night. I had me a servant, 2 pack mules, some flour, meal, bacon, sorghum, and chickens. So we were going to live for a day or 2, provided we didn't get shot.
Army life was hard not only on the soldier, but on his clothing. Soldiers were allotted only 2 uniform issues per year. Occasionally, those uniforms could be replaced due to hard campaigning, but it was the duty of each soldier to care for his personal clothing. Soldiers were charged against their pay for lost or damaged uniform parts. Even though jacket and pants were made of durable wool, they often needed to be repaired as they became worn. The most common repair was the replacement of lost buttons. Even more challenging was the repair of tears in the fabric or the seams. In order to make those repairs, a soldier carried in his haversack a sewing kit known as a housewife. These were not issued by the Army, but were given by ladies, wives, sisters, sweethearts, or aid societies for use in the field. Because housewives were tokens, each one was different. Some were plain, others were example of the finest design and craft. Each housewife typically contained needles, pins, various thread for different applications, spare buttons, and perhaps a thimble. Thimbles were used in sewing. This particular housewife has a really nice place to stick the thimble. The interiors of the housewives are usually lavish and rich. Here's another example of an interior of a housewife. This particular one has a silk interior. In this example, the area where spare needles are kept was made from wool. The wool has been elaborately cut in a circle design with a sawtooth pattern. This example is more homemade. It's easy to see that the interior piece of silk probably came from a lady's dress, one of a girlfriend, wife, or mother. The needle area has initials embroidered into it, ACM, probably for the user. Each one of these pages would have different sized needles inside, some for heavy work and some for light work. Spare buttons could be found in a little pocket that was directly underneath the needle area. Rolling up the housewife made it very compact and easy to fit into a backpack. Most soldiers were not adept at sewing, but did it anyway, and they kept this useful keepsake, this housewife, as a reminder of home. In order to keep your musket in good repair and able to fire, there were certain tools that were needed to service it. Some of these tools were carried by individual soldiers. Other tools for more specialized functions were carried by the non-commissioned officers in the regiment. The ramrod end is threaded so that these tools can be fitted to it. This is the worm. It's used to clean the inside of the barrel. It's actually used to grab patches that are saturated with oil. Patches are cloth that are either linen or cotton that are used to wipe down the inside of the barrel with the worm. Occasionally they'll fall off, and the worm can grab it. There's our patch. The bullet puller also screws onto the end of the ramrod. The bullet puller had coarse threads like a wood screw. When it went down the barrel to the stuck bullet, it could be screwed in, grab the ball, and then pull it out the end of the barrel. These are some of the other tools that are needed to take the musket apart. This is the musket tool or nipple wrench. And this is a spring vise. This tool is called a pin punch. The musket's pretty easy to take apart. The first thing you need to do is pull the ramrod out. The next piece to come off are the barrel bands. There are 3 barrel bands. You collapse the spring, pull them out, take them off. Next you take the musket tool, which is a 3-bladed screwdriver. Open it up to the widest blade and take out the top screw to the barrel. barrel can now be lifted out of the stock. The hammer has to be cocked back, and the barrel is just simply lifted right out. The musket tool also has a wrench end on it. The wrench end is used to take the cone off. A cone is the place where a gun can be easily fouled. Fouling is a buildup of powder that creates a constriction where the charge is to be fired. With the cone removed, the barrel can be easily cleaned and the cone checked to see whether it's clear or not. The musket tool is again used to remove the screws on the back of the lock. When the screws are removed, the lock can be taken out. The lock is the mechanism that has all the internal parts and springs that allow the hammer to drop and fire the gun. The musket tool is again used to remove the screws from the trigger guard and the trigger. These screws are seated directly into wood. In order to completely remove the trigger and trigger guard, a pin punch is used. The pin punch is also used to take out the barrel band springs. There are 5 internal parts in the lock that can be taken apart to break it down further. The first thing that must be done is the main spring screw must be loosened and removed. The 5 major parts inside the lock are the main spring, the sear spring, the sear which comes in contact with the trigger, the bridle, and the tumbler. To collapse the mainspring, a spring vise is put onto the spring and tightened. That holds it in place so it can be lifted out. Before any of the internal parts can be removed, the mainspring must be collapsed and held in place. You'll notice visually the difference between the lock plate and the internal parts here. These parts are case hardened. That's why they're dark blue. They are harder metal than the lock plate itself because they come in much more contact with themselves, and there is much more wear on them. Case hardening is a heating and cooling process that makes those parts stronger than regular steel. To put it all together, you just do all that backwards. The musket is now reassembled. blue and the gray. I'm wearing the Federal Army officer's uniform, which during the Civil War, by regulation, was dark blue. The Confederate Army, by regulation, wore gray. The uniform beside me is a Confederate general officer's uniform. A general officer would be either a brigadier general, a major general, or a lieutenant general. In the United States Army, an officer's insignia was worn on his shoulder, and they were known as shoulder straps. In the Confederate Army, that system was abandoned. The Confederate officer's rank was shown on the collar. There were various symbols to determine each different rank. This particular symbol, the wreath, with 2 stars, 2 small stars and 1 large star, is the insignia of a brigadier general. The collar insignia is supplemented by the pattern on the sleeve. This is called cuff braiding, sleeve braiding, or galloons. It's a delicate, intricate pattern which crisscrosses and is braided, comes all the way up the sleeve almost to the shoulder. Rank could be determined by looking at the number of pieces of braid used to make the pattern. A lieutenant, for instance, would have 1 strand in the pattern, a captain 2. A major, lieutenant colonel, or colonel would have 3 strands, and all generals would have 4 strands, as you see here. The buff or tan color here worked in underneath the braid shows that it's a general officer's coat. A general officer, again, being either a brigadier general, a major general, or a lieutenant general. If the color were light blue, he would be an infantry officer. If it were yellow, a cavalry officer. Red trim would signify an artillery officer. Another way to tell an officer's rank was by the button groupings. General officers would have buttons in groupings of either 2s or 3s on their double-breasted jacket. Button groupings of 2s would signify a brigadier general. Button groupings of 3 would signify a major general. This coat is a variant. The button groupings here are equally spaced, 7 on each side, 14 buttons total. That button grouping would signify the rank of a field officer, major, lieutenant colonel, or colonel, but he wears the rank of a general. The reason for this could be this particular officer was at first a colonel. Clothing being very hard to get in the Confederate service, instead of ordering a new coat, he adapted his colonel's coat to the rank of brigadier general. The buttons on the front of this jacket are Federal staff buttons. They are not Confederate staff buttons. They are not Confederate state buttons, but Federal staff buttons. This is due to the fact that these buttons were readily available, especially before the war, and were easy to come upon by tailors who were making uniforms for the service. It was not unusual to see Federal buttons employed on Confederate uniforms. Another interesting feature on this jacket is the cuffs. The 2 bottom buttons seen here on the cuffs are Virginia State Seal buttons. Those are buttons with the emblem of the state of Virginia. The 3rd button, the top button, is a match to the front buttons of the jacket. It is a Federal Eagle staff button. The insignia of a general is 3 stars, 2 smaller ones with a large one in the center. A colonel also has the insignia of 3 stars, but they're of equal size. What sets this apart from a colonel to a general is also the wreath that appears underneath the stars and the buff color behind the background. Buttonholes on a Civil War coat also are indicative of the manufacturing processes that were available at the time. There were no machines that made machine-made buttonholes, but if one were to look at a buttonhole, it would appear as if that was made by a machine because the sewing is so perfect and regular. One of the secrets to that is the cord piping you see here. There's actually a small ribbon of cording around the buttonhole, which is then sewn onto the buttonhole to give it a very finished appearance. From the front, it appears as if a machine did it. From the back, it's easy to see the hand stitches. The buff or tan trim can also be seen along the edge of the coat, worked in as piping. The coat is very nicely tailored and shows the fashion of the day. It's closely fitted and has 4 panels across the back of the coat. The top of the jacket is very form-fitting and tight. The skirts, however, are cut very full and show a very rakish flare that was the fashion of the day. In the back of the jacket and the skirts are the pockets, one on each side. This is where an officer would carry his personal items. The tail pockets on this coat are inside and are very deep. Let's take a look at the inside of the jacket at the lining. The lining is made of satinette and is totally hand-stitched. These quilted lines, called darts, actually help the jacket to be more form-fitting. Here we'll take a look where the satinette joins the arm lining, and you can see the careful, tiny hand stitches. These quilted lines only show on the inside, and they help connect the lining of the coat to the fabric. They give the coat a full-chested, pigeon breast appearance. This coat is a non-regulation coat for a general. It has a colonel's button configuration, but general's insignia. Even with that, we can find photographic examples of generals who wore this type of coat. Generals like John Chambliss. The insignia is made of spun bullion wire, which is elaborately embroidered into the design of the wreath and stars. Bullion wire is very fine brass wire spun around a single thread, and then it's used in embroidery stitching. Over time and hard service, the coat has taken on a darker color. If we look to some areas in the jacket that were protected from the elements, we could find the original color of the jacket. You can see there's a slight nap to the wool, and that the color is almost more blue than gray. In fact, when you look very close at the threads of the wool, the gray color is achieved here by mixing white threads and blue threads together.
For 40 years, the journal Confederate Veteran found its way into thousands of homes across the nation. Established by a former Confederate soldier, Sumner A. Cunningham, the journal first appeared in January 1893 and was continuously published monthly until December 1932. The magazine cost 10 cents an issue, or mail subscribers paid $1 per year. The pages of Confederate Veteran were rich with articles and memoirs written by former Confederate soldiers, as well as biographies, death notices, monument dedications, and information about reunions. Its value increased to the readership as it became the official publication of the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The August 1901 issue is typical of the publication as it contains much diverse and interesting information. Recent reunions, including one in Memphis, Tennessee, are highlighted. A photo of 5 aged veterans who attended the reunion illustrates the article. Another article documents the monument dedication in Wytheville, Virginia. The story is accompanied by a photograph of the obelisk monument. Veterans' accounts of the war between the states include a short article written by a former member of the 8th Tennessee Infantry who writes about the Battle of Murfreesboro, Tennessee.
Some veterans use the journal's format to reply to previously published articles. Running commentaries or debates could be followed through the years of publication of the Confederate Veteran. A typical example can be found in this August 1901 edition.
A veteran claiming to have been the South's youngest soldier comes under attack from another veteran who claims the distinction for himself. The 1901 contributor claims he was 11 years old when he helped to raise, drill, and organize the 15th Alabama. He goes on to rebut a previous author's article who claimed the title.
The first author alleged he was 13 on enlistment. Ironically, they both were in the same regiment.
The United Confederate Veterans, official veterans organization of former Southern soldiers, published a listing of all member camps throughout the country in the journal. It is interesting to note that not all camps are located in southern states. Some are found in California, Illinois, Massachusetts, and as far away as Montana. A portion of the journal titled The Last Roll presented obituaries and often photos of deceased Confederate veterans. Among those in the August 1901 edition is Major Allen Dickinson of Wheat's famous Louisiana Tigers. Dickinson later served on the staff of General Lunsford L. Lomax. Another obituary profiles Lieutenant Aquila Hutton, formerly with the 36th Alabama Infantry and later with an independent Confederate cavalry company. A handsome wartime photograph of a youthful Lieutenant Hutton in uniform accompanies the obituary. Advertisements from the turn of the 20th century adorn the pages of the veteran. One ad offered cheap Texas lands for sale. Another promoted medicine to cure asthma. Here's an antiquated ad for the Smith Premier typewriter. And free homes in the new white man's country out west. Patriotic ladies' hat pins adorned with the Confederate flag could be purchased by mail. The Muldoon Monument Company of Louisville, Kentucky, placed an ad targeted at veterans organizations, illustrated with a statue of a Confederate soldier standing at parade rest. Due to the decreasing number of living subscribers, the Confederate Veterans ceased publication in 1932. Left in the shadow was a written record of Southern history totaling 20,000 pages with thousands of accompanying illustrations. The veterans' compiled history and information in print has become a legacy and a valuable, legitimate voice of the Southern soldier. The Civil War resulted in countless families, North and South, being separated by the call to arms. Fathers, sons, husbands, and other loved ones joined the warring armies by the thousands, leaving at home their wives, children, and many others of their extended families. It could take months, if not years, before the soldiers in blue and gray would be reunited with the folks back home. On a rare occasion, when the business of war brought a soldier near home, the temptation to steal away from duty for a few hours was just too much to ignore. In the ranks, the absence was known as a French leave. If caught away without permission, military discipline could be severe.
Just after the Battle of Gettysburg, Samuel Cormany, a Union private in the 16th Pennsylvania Cavalry, made a surprise visit to his nearby home in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, to visit his wife Rachel and his daughter Cora.
Samuel was born on a farm in the area of Chambersburg some 25 years earlier. Rachel was a native of Canada. The pair were married in 1860 and lived in Canada when the war broke out. Returning to the States in 1862 with daughter Cora in tow, Samuel Cormany decided to enlist in the Army, joining Company I of the 16th Pennsylvania Cavalry in September 1862. The Cormany family was separated by war as Sam joined his fellow troopers at the front. By 1863, Samuel was an experienced and seasoned cavalryman. As the armies moved northward into Pennsylvania, Cormany soon found himself defending his native state. Like many soldiers, Private Cormany kept a diary and noted his experiences in the Battle of Gettysburg.
We were roused early and were soon off with the brigade and took Rebel General Stewart by surprise on the right and rear of the Army line, where Stewart was expected to at least annoy the rear of General Meade. While our mounted men were paying attention to General Stewart, we fellows had our horses cared for and were marched down on the right of the main line to occupy a gap and do some sharpshooting at long range with our carbines. We soon attracted attention, and later, an occasional shell fell conspicuously close.
On the next day, July 3, 1863, Cormany was near the fighting on skirmish duty with the 16th Pennsylvania Cavalry. He recalled the sounds and sights of the bombardment that preceded Pickett's charge. That evening, Sam penned in his diary,
"Cannonading commenced early, and battle was on again in full intensity. At 10 o'clock, we were ordered to the front and center, but immediately removed to the right of the center. Had some pretty lively skirmishing. Our squadron almost ran into a rebel battery, with a brigade of cavalry maneuvering in the woods. They didn't want to see us, but moved leftward, and we held the woods all evening. All seemed rather quiet for several hours. From 1:30 till 4 p.m., there was the heaviest cannonading I have ever heard. One constant roar with rising and falling inflections. Our boys opening 54 guns at the same time on the rebel lines and works from a little conical hill, Cemetery Ridge. We were picketing in the rear and on the right of it. Many shells came our way, some really quite near, but it was wonderful how few really made our acquaintance.
General Lee had hoped for success on July 3rd. After the attack failed to dislodge General George Meade's federal forces from Cemetery Ridge, he retreated from the battlefield late on July 4th. Samuel Cormany and his regiment were soon sent in pursuit of Lee's retreating column, and by July 6th neared Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. This was Cormany's hometown and the residence of his wife and daughter. Trooper Cormany took French leave and paid them a surprise visit.
Monday, July 6th. We took up the march via Fayetteville for Quincy. I told Corporal Metz I intended going to Chambersburg to see wife and baby and would report in the morning again. He understood, and I slipped away and was soon making for home. As I struck the edge of town, I was told the rebel rear guard had just left the Diamond. So I ventured out 2nd Street and ventured to Street Main, and behold, they were at the door. It was a surprise and delight to meet after the awful battle they had been listening to for passing days. To attempt to describe my joy and feelings at meeting and greeting my dear little family must prove a failure. We spent the PM and the evening very sweetly and pleasantly.
Samuel's wife Rachel also kept a wartime diary. In it, she recorded the moment that her beloved husband rode up to the door.
I was sitting reading, Cora playing by my side, when little Willie Wampler came running as fast as he could to tell me a soldier had come up to see me, and sure enough, when I got to the door, Mr. Cormany just rode up. I was so very glad to see him that I scarcely knew how to act.
Private Cormany spent the night with his family, but could stay no longer. At 7 o'clock in the morning the next day, he left in search of his regiment. After finding it, he spent time to reflect on his visit from home by recording it in his diary.
Now that I have again seen my dearest ones on earth, have loved and caressed them profusely, soldiering seems almost a new thing again, and altogether desirable, since country, home, and dear ones must be defended.
Rachel, of course, hated to see her Samuel leave, lamenting in her diary,
Mr. C is gone again. I can hardly stay in. I feel so lonely.
Although brief, the reunion had been a pleasant one for Rachel, Samuel, and little Cora. Samuel went back to the fighting, and Rachel to her life in Chambersburg. That wonderful day in July 1863 would long be remembered as a bright spot in the lives of the young couple torn apart by war.
Confederate Brigadier General John R. Chambliss was wearing this non-regulation sword on August 16, 1864, when he was killed on Charles City Road, Virginia.
By 1864, Brigadier General John R. Chambliss was one of the Confederacy's most successful cavalry commanders. Chambliss was a native Virginian and an 1853 graduate of the United States Military Academy. He began the war as a colonel of an infantry regiment, but was soon transferred to the Mounted Arm as a colonel of the 13th Virginia Cavalry in July 1862. In November, he was assigned to Brigadier General William Rooney Lee's brigade of General Jeb Stuart's Cavalry Division, Army of Northern Virginia. Over the next year, Colonel Chambliss saw much combat. He rode at the head of his regiment, and sometimes the brigade, in such battles as Brandy Station, Aldie, and Gettysburg. In January 1864, Chambliss earned a promotion to Brigadier General and continued to command a brigade of Virginians under General Jeb Stuart. During the spring and summer of 1864, General Chambliss and his brigade fought many pitched battles against Yankee cavalry. With determination and luck, they were often victorious. The general's luck ran out on August 16, 1864. As Union cavalry under David Gregg probed toward Richmond along the Charles City Road, Chambliss, commanding his regiments at the front, rode into a precarious situation. Leading General Gregg's advance down the Charles City Road that morning was Lieutenant Samuel Cormany and 20 troopers of the 16th Pennsylvania Cavalry. As they rode, Cormany and his men were fired on by rebel cavalrymen from General Chambliss's brigade. The Pennsylvanians responded with fire of their own and kept moving steadily on. Lieutenant Cormany, a veteran officer with 2 years' hard service in the saddle, recorded the scene in his diary as events unfolded.
Now we came to a bend in the road. We could not see 100 yards ahead. My men were in 5 sections of 4s, about 8 or 10 feet apart. I rode beside my first section. Bullets buzzed above and about us occasionally. As we came into a piece of straight road, I saw before us in the road, not 200 yards away, a fine-looking man in gray, well mounted. Halt, he disregarded, but wheeled to get away. My command, first section fire, sent 4 Spencer carbine bullets after him. He reeled to the left of the road and fell from his horse.
The fine-looking man in gray, shot from the saddle by Lieutenant Cormany's troopers, was Brigadier General John Chambliss, who had ridden unexpectedly into their midst. Dashing forward, Cormany and his men reined up beside the fallen Confederate. Lieutenant Cormany dismounted to examine the fallen foe.
His right hand was over his bosom as he lay on his back. Close to his fingertips, near the middle of his breast, were 2 bullet holes, showing where 2 of the 4 shots had come through him from the rear as he vainly tried to get away. Dead? Of course he was.
After examining General Chambliss's body, Cormany ordered one of his troopers to retrieve the general's pipe, sword, and belt. Cormany and his troopers then rode ahead to continue the battle.
Several hours later, darkness put an end to the bloody fighting along the Charles City Road. The death of the 31-year-old Confederate general was soon known in both armies. General Robert E. Lee commented after receiving the news,
"The loss sustained by the cavalry in the fall of General Chambliss will be felt throughout the Army, in which his courage, energy, and skill he had won for himself an honorable name."
General Chambliss's body was recovered and returned to his home in Hicksford, Virginia, for final burial. His sword remained in use, worn as a trophy of war by Lieutenant Samuel Cormany until his discharge in 1865.
This sword is a non-regulation steel-hilted saber with an English crest design in the hilt. General Chambliss's sword is a non-regulation working sword, an everyday sword that an officer would have carried. It's not a presentation grade, it has no fancy silver mounts, it has no ivory grips, no presentation on the blade. It has a steel hilt, a steel scabbard, steel blade, sharkskin grips with copper wire wrapped around. You can see the wear on the handle from where General Chambliss and Lieutenant Cormany handled the sword a lot. The scabbard is also steel. A good working sword should have a steel scabbard to withstand the vigors of everyday campaign life. The steel basket or hilt has a cutout design in it, reflecting its European origin. The sword is an English sword, and the cutout in the hilt is the crest of a foot regiment in the English Army. This sword is an example of swords that were made in Europe and imported to the Confederacy due to the shortage of manufacturing ability that the South had. The blade is made of good quality metal and bears a proof mark, which is actually impressed into the blade and stamped with the word proof. With the basket of this sword being steel, it was unusual even as an import and was easily recognized as an unusual piece of hardware for an officer to wear. The blade is acid etched with typical floral designs of the period, including a 6-pointed star near the proof marking. The dent in the scabbard reflects the marks put into the sword intentionally to keep it in the scabbard when Chambliss was riding. Officers carried swords in order to guide their troops and give them direction. Occasionally they would be used for self-defense or fighting, but that was not the norm. A few days after Chambliss was killed, Cormany was on picket duty. While on picket duty, he had the opportunity to speak with a Confederate picket on the opposite side. That Confederate recognized this sword. He recognized that it was his general's sword, General John R. Chambliss. Due to that fact, Cormany gave the Confederate picket Chambliss's pipe. But Cormany kept the sword and wore it through the remainder of the war. He brought it home as a souvenir, and to this day, it remains in his family's possession as a treasured relic. During the Battle of Yellow Tavern, Virginia, Private Cyrus McCormick of the 6th Virginia Cavalry was one of Jeb Stuart's couriers. During the heat of the battle, on May 11, 1864, young McCormick witnessed the mortal wounding of the great cavalry chieftain.
On the morning of the fight at Yellow Tavern, I was acting as one of Stuart's couriers. At the beginning of it, I was stationed in front of the tavern under one of a row of trees that lined the way close by. To my left, about 400 yards off, the enemy could be easily seen emerging from a piece of woods and forming for battle. A short distance to my right, I saw an irregular line of Confederates. Pretty soon, from the enemy came lively volleys, whistling through the trees and starting the dust in the road. In a few minutes, I saw 2 horsemen approach from the Confederate side. As they drew near, I recognized General Stuart and Colonel Walter Hullion. They halted nearby in the road, and Stuart, taking out his field glass, deliberately watched the maneuvers of the enemy, though balls were whizzing past him. Presently, regardless of the increasing fire, which was now accompanied with shouts, Stuart put his glass away, and taking out paper and pencil, wrote an order. Handing it to Colonel Hullion, he told him to take it to General Lomax. That officer replied by pointing to me and suggesting that I should carry it. Stuart assented, and I rode off in search of General Lomax. The firing continued to increase, and many squadrons were in sight. The enemy, awake to their superior numbers, seemed about to make a general advance, when our men were availing themselves of the character of the ground to repel their attack. I soon came to where General Lomax was, and coming into collision with his horse, gained his immediate attention. After reading the note, he told me to go back and tell General Stuart that the order had been delivered. In a few moments, I rejoined Stuart. He was sitting on his horse, close behind a line of dismounted men, who were firing at the advancing Federals. The disparity of numbers between the opposing forces was very great, to judge from appearances. Our men seemed aware of their inferior strength, but were not dismayed. The enemy confidently pressed forward with exult shouts, delivering tremendous volleys. The Confederates returned their fire with yells of defiance. Stuart, with pistol in hand, shot over the heads of the troops, while, with words of cheer, he encouraged them. He kept saying, "Steady, men, steady." Presently, he reeled in his saddle. He turned and said as I drew nearer, "Go and tell General Lee and Dr. Fontaine to come here." I wheeled at once and went as fast as I could to do his bidding. Coming to the part of the line where General Lomax was, I told him Stuart was hurt and that he wanted General Fitz Lee. He pointed to the left and told me to hurry. Soon I found General Lee and delivered the message, and instantly upon receipt of the news went like an arrow down the line. When I returned, Stuart had been taken from his horse and was being carried by his men off the field. I saw him put in an ambulance, and I followed it close behind. He lay without speaking as it went along, but kept shaking his head with an expression of the deepest disappointment. He died the next day, May 12th.
General Stuart died of his wounds on May 12, 1864. Private McCormick survived the war and later went on to write about his experiences in the Confederate veteran paper Southern Bivouac, some 20 years later in 1884.
Many sights and sounds were common in a Civil War soldier's daily routine. The single most signature sound to both armies north and south wasn't the boom of cannon, the crash of musketry, or the tramp of marching feet. It had to be the universal beat of the drum. The drum had many uses, much more than simply keeping musical time. It became a sophisticated communication device. One Pennsylvania drummer said the drum was the tongue of the camp. Throughout the day, beginning in the morning with reveille, to lights out at night, drummers would beat out calls that were signals for various military activities or functions to be carried out. Drummers were an integral part of each infantry regiment. Each of the 10 companies that composed the regiment held 2 positions for field musicians. So in a 10-company regiment of 1,000 men, this meant 20 of those men were field musicians. There could be 2 drummers or a drummer and fifer per company. Fifers provided the melodies to the numerous songs played during the routines of everyday life. When not performing daily duties directly with their assigned company, musicians would be massed together in a regimental drum corps and would be stationed near the regimental headquarters, where they could be easily used by the command structure of the regiment. When not campaigning or engaged in combat, regimental drum corps sounded all the duty calls as instructed by the daily schedule. There were as many as 67 distinct calls that were used by the drummers and fifers to affect the motions of military life.
Various calls given in camp during the day were like announcements. These calls were known as duty calls. One of the calls was drummer's call, which was a call that called the drummers together so they could perform their daily duties. Drummer's call. This call was to summon the troops to come to breakfast. It's known as breakfast call. Another duty call, which signaled the end of the day, brought soldiers back to their quarters. It was known as the retreat. Some calls were specifically meant to call certain individuals, such as officers or non-commissioned officers. This call is First Sergeant's call. Another variation of this call was the Sergeant's call. A third variation is Corporal's call. One of the most important calls a drummer could give was known as the long roll. It was used daily to call men into line, but could be used in emergencies to quickly call all the men from their places into a line of battle. The long roll. A battalion could be instructed to fire or cease fire by a drum call. In this firing command, the battalion was trained to fire at the last beat of the call. Fire.
Each one of these unique rhythms was practiced by a regiment over and over again until every soldier understood the signal as if he had been given an order by the voice of the commanding officer himself, which in effect he had. During the drill day, soldiers were broken into various sized groups to learn and hone the drill steps that could mean the difference between life and death in combat. Since the drum was a regulation article, the government was obligated to issue one to each drummer. According to quartermaster records, the federal government purchased and issued 37,496 drums between 1861 and 1865. 1861 regulations, Article 113 said, "The front of the drums will be painted with the arms of the United States, on a blue field for the infantry and on a red field for the artillery. The letter of the company and the number of the regiment under the arms in a scroll." Issue drums were distributed through the military depots of Philadelphia, New York, and Cincinnati. Due to the immediate need for the instrument in the field, most drums went out without the regulation painting on the front. There were occasions when drums would be used as presentation items. Elaborately painted pieces were often presented to a favorite regimental drummer or one who was particularly brave under battlefield conditions. During the Battle of Fredericksburg, 12-year-old drummer Robert H. Hendershot, according to some embellished accounts, had his drum struck and torn to pieces as he climbed the banks of the Rappahannock. His exploits became rather famous, and for that reason he was presented a German silver drum engraved on the shell, presented to Robert Henry Hendershot of the 8th Michigan Infantry for his gallantry at the attack on Fredericksburg, 11th December, 1862. It was more likely that when a fight drew near, drummers would be dismissed from company duty to mass together and serve with brigade headquarters. Their instruments sent to the rear with the baggage, the musicians would then serve the regiment as stretcher bearers. Many drummers were under the age of 18, the legal age to enlist and carry a weapon. Regulations of 1857, in use when the war began in 1861, stated that the minimum age of a recruit accepted as a musician was 12. Not all musicians were this young, however, as it was found that these very young boys could not acclimate well to the vigors of Army life. Yes, there were some few drummer boys of this age, but a much more agreeable age was 14 to 16. These teenage boys could stand the hard marching and deprivations that Army life brought. Not all drummers were boys, though. Many were of average Army age, and some were even older. It was not unusual to see a much older man as a drummer. Chances were that as a musician, an older man could render valuable service and not be subject to the rigorous life of an enlisted soldier who would face combat. Northern and Southern armies alike lived their daily lives to the heartbeat of the drum. The powerful reverberation of the drum corps could stir the weak at heart and inspire the brave. That common sound of both warring American armies still continues to ring as an authentic voice, calling us back to that time long ago.
When the warring armies laid aside their arms in 1865, they left behind a legacy of valor and accomplishments unsurpassed in the annals of American history.
One of the most famous military units of the 4-year-long struggle was the Confederacy's Stonewall Brigade. The brigade was comprised of the 2nd, 4th, 5th, 27th, and 33rd Virginia Infantry Regiments. It was first commanded by Brigadier General Thomas J. Jackson. Jackson and his brigade fought so determinedly at 1st Manassas, or Bull Run as the Federal Army would call it, that they would be known forever as Stonewall Jackson and the Stonewall Brigade. The name Stonewall came during the fighting when the brigade was noticed to be holding its position against the Yankees as if they were an impregnable stone wall. Veterans of the legendary brigade were extremely proud of their war record. For as long as they lived, they regularly gathered for company, regimental, or brigade reunions. On September 13, 1894, the veterans of the Monroe Guard, Company D of the 27th Virginia Infantry, Stonewall Brigade, gathered for a reunion in Monroe County, West Virginia. The original company was organized in April and May 1861 when it was enlisted for Confederate service in Monroe County, Virginia.
All 108 soldiers were part of the 27th Virginia Infantry, which was assigned to the 1st Virginia Brigade, which was commanded by the yet unknown Colonel Thomas J. Jackson.
From humble beginnings, the men of the Monroe Guard would go on to become part of a brigade that fought some of the largest and most decisive battles of the American Civil War. Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, and Spotsylvania, just to name a few.
At war's end, in April 1865, few of the 108 original members of the company were still in the ranks. Many had been killed or wounded during the course of the war.
At the September reunion in 1894, only 11 members of the old Monroe Guard were able to attend. Each veteran wore a large Stonewall Brigade veterans ribbon proudly pinned to his jacket.
Of those attending, some had colorful and distinguished careers.
William Preston Young, a farmer, began his enlistment in the Monroe Guards as a corporal, eventually working his way to first lieutenant. He often commanded the company and was captured at the Battle of Spotsylvania, Virginia on May 10, 1864. Incarcerated in Fort Delaware Military Prison, he was finally released in June 1865.
After the war, he returned to farming. He died at age 75 in 1913.
Lachlan C. Vass was a 30-year-old Presbyterian minister when the war began.
He joined the 27th Virginia in December of 1862 as chaplain. He administered to the spiritual needs of the soldiers and was captured at Frederick, Maryland in July of 1864.
He was sent to Baltimore, exchanged in August, and spent the remainder of the war in Petersburg, Virginia as post chaplain. Following the war, the Reverend Vass was chaplain of the University of Virginia for more than 30 years before his death in 1896. One of the most outstanding former soldiers at the reunion was Richard S. McCartney. A 20-year-old student when he enlisted, McCartney was captured at the Battle of Kernstown, Virginia in March 1862. Imprisoned by his captors, he was later released. He served much of the war as regimental color bearer, a post of honor, but dangerously visible in battle. Flag bearers and members of the color guard were often killed and wounded. McCartney was shot twice during the war. His first wound was in the right thigh at Chancellorsville in May 1863, the second in the right temple at the Battle of Cold Harbor in 1864. He was sent to a Richmond hospital to recover from the head wound and later transferred to one in Lynchburg. Due to his wounds, he was absent from his company when it was surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse in 1865. The men of the Stonewall Brigade never forgot their old commander, General Thomas Jackson.
In July 1891, 30 years after achieving fame at the Battle of Bull Run, the members of Stonewall Jackson's old brigade took part in ceremonies dedicating a statue to him at his grave in Lexington, Virginia.
On the day of the dedication, the graying veterans formed a column and marched to General Jackson's gravesite, led by none other than Monroe Guard Sergeant Richard McCartney, carrying the battle flag of the Confederacy.